Hi everyone, my name is Jeff Ott. I'm a research biologist with the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Boise, Idaho. And I'm going to be presenting some results from a study where we looked at the outcome of post-fire seeding treatments. This was an operational scale experiment where we tested different seed mixes, some of which were conventional, meaning that they had non-native species in them, and others which were exclusively native. I want to start by recognizing my co-authors, Francis Kilkenny, Danny Summers, and Tyler Thompson, and thank a number of other people who have helped out with this project. It's been a multi-agency effort with different sources of funding over the years. And my own personal connection to this study began on July 2nd, 1999, when I witnessed the railroad fire burning in Tintic Valley, Utah. I was collecting vegetation data for my master's project in an area that had burned a few years earlier. And I noticed this plume of smoke off in the distance, and pretty soon it wasn't so far away, and I saw these flames, and I decided to quit for the day. And some of my study sites got burned that day, but fortunately I was gone by the time that happened. This fire burned several thousand acres of mostly sagebrush and pinyon juniper vegetation, mostly on BLM land. After the fire, plans were made for post-fire rehab, which included a proposal for seeding, mostly using introduced forage grasses. But during a field tour not long after the fire, there was a discussion where some people questioned this strategy and wanted to see more native species used. Some even wanted to use exclusively native species, which wasn't a very common practice at the time. This proposal was met with resistance by the local managers who felt that native seed mixes were unreliable and not likely to meet rehabilitation objectives. But they conceded that they hadn't really tested native seed enough to determine how well it would work. So what ended up happening, this group of people with different perspectives on seeding ended up agreeing to carry out an experiment where they would test different seed mixes and see how well they worked compared to each other. And this opened up an opportunity for another master's project, which Tyler Thompson took on, and his work resulted in this publication in 2006. I got involved later when we got funding to go back and collect new data, starting in 2015. Leading to this paper that was published last year. My purpose here is to summarize some material from these publications and also expand on them and present some unpublished results on this topic. There were two sites that were included in this study. Mud Springs is a higher elevation pinyon juniper site where seeding was done aerially, and Jericho is a lower elevation sagebrush site that was drill seeded. And these different seeding techniques were used because of their appropriateness for these different settings. This wasn't a comparison of these different techniques, and each site was evaluated as a separate experiment. You can see some additional information about these sites and how the treatments were laid out in 5 blocks per site. Within each block, there were 5 treatments that were randomly assigned in strips. 4 seeded treatments and an unseeded control. And here you can see the list of species that were included in the mixes at the drill seeding. I've got this color-coded for native and non-native prayer grasses and shrubs and forbs. The ARS and BLM mixes were named for the agencies that were responsible for developing them. So we've got the Agricultural Research Service and the Bureau of Land Management. And these were the conventional mixes. So these were primarily non-native species, but they also included some natives. The other 2 mixes contained only native species. The native high had more species and higher seeding rates than native low. These mixes were formulated by people from the Forest Service Shrub Sciences Lab and the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. And here's the list of species in the aerial seed mix. Just to point out, it was similar but not identical, and there were some differences in seeding rates. This table shows in greater detail the seeded species, seeding rates, also the varieties and cultivars. And in nearly all cases, these were non-local seed sources. So something to keep in mind here. This likely had an effect on the outcome. This table also shows costs of each seed mix, both in 1999, when the seeding took place, and in 2017, based on a reevaluation of the same plant materials, what they were going for in the market that year. The 1999 values are adjusted for inflation here. And shown in a graph, you can see that the native mixes were higher in their overall cost. But between these two time periods from 1999 to 2017, there was a decrease in cost for those mixes as many native species became more affordable during this period. So now I'm going to show some results in terms of plant cover using this graph where here we're showing seeded species cover in the post-fire seeding treatments. So these panels show ARS, BLM, native high, native low on top of Mud Springs and below Jericho. And each of these pairs of bars is for a different species, color-coded by these different categories. The bar on the right is the mean cover for years 1 to 3, and on the left for years 16 to 18, the two different monitoring periods. So this shows basically what we got from these seedings. And you can see that there are differences in which species actually got established and how they fared over time. In the ARS and BLM treatments, it was mostly these non-native perennial grasses, such as crested and Siberian wheatgrass and intermediate wheatgrass and smooth brome that became established and became dominant. But the native seedings also had some grasses that did fairly well, especially western wheatgrass and blue bunch at Mud Springs. Next, I'm going to expand this graph to show other species that weren't seeded, but were present at these sites. And this graph also shows the unseeded control, USC. You can see from this that plant communities differed in composition and abundance. I want to highlight a couple of things here. The annual grasses, which were primarily cheatgrass, an invasive species, showed a consistent pattern at both sites where cheatgrass increased between time periods and became especially abundant in the unseeded controls. But there was less cheatgrass in the native mixes, and it was lowest in the conventional mixes. This suggests that the conventional mixes had species that were especially good at competing with cheatgrass, but the native mixes also did reasonably well at this. On the other hand, there were practically no shrubs in the ARS and BLM treatments, in contrast to the others. This is probably in part because there were fewer shrubs in these conventional mixes, but it also suggests that shrub recruitment was being inhibited by the non-native grasses. The competitiveness of these grasses was thus helpful on one hand, but also appeared to have this less desirable side effect. So to give a visual image of these results, here are some photos from the Jericho site in 2015. And you can see from these pictures the differences in composition of the shrubs, annual grasses, perennial grasses, and so forth. Likewise, here's some photos from the Mud Springs site, also from 2015. So another question we wanted to ask is what is the successional trajectory of these treatments? And how well do they compare with the native communities that you would expect to develop on these sites over time after fire? And so to ask this question, we did a little bit more sampling in 2017. We looked for places that hadn't burned near these study sites and sampled the vegetation of those areas. As you can see from some photos, there were mixture of pinyon juniper and sagebrush at Mud Springs and mostly sagebrush at Jericho. But we also wanted to see what the reference conditions would be like based on studies that have been done through the ecological site description program that has mapped through the web soil survey what is to be expected at these sites. So we, in this case, looked at all the ecological sites that have been mapped within 500 meters of the treatments, and we got the data that was available online for these, and then considered how the composition of these communities, reference communities, compared with these burn treatments. So expanding this graph now, I'm showing those same burn treatments on the left, and then these two reference states on the right, the unburned reference, which is those locally sampled communities, and then the ecological site description reference states. We found that these unburned references had an overabundance of Utah juniper at Mud Springs, an overabundance of big sagebrush at Jericho. And this is evidence that these are different than the historical baseline. Whereas the ecological site description showed a higher diversity and more of a balance between these woody and herbaceous species. So if you look closely at this graph, you can see that some of the burn treatments were more similar to the reference states than others. And to quantify that, this graph shows the overall similarity of the treatments to the unburned and ESD reference states, broken down by two different periods. The higher on the y-axis, the more similar the composition to the reference state. And there are several cases here where the native high, native low, and unseeded control moved up on that y-axis over time. And on the other hand, ARS and BLM stay pretty much the same. And looking specifically at similarity to the ESD reference in this later period, there's this pattern where native high, native low were most similar, followed by unseeded control, and then ARS and BLM. And so suggesting that native seedings, especially native high, resulted in the best approximation of these ecological site reference communities by the end of this monitoring period. So to summarize, this study illustrates that scenic selection has long-term implications, and there are trade-offs between using conventional and native mixes. Although this study was limited to just 2 sites and a limited number of mixes and plant materials, I think it shows the type of trade-offs that might be encountered elsewhere. In this case, the conventional mixes had the advantage of being more familiar and lower cost. While this is becoming a less of an issue over time for the native mixes. We found that conventional mixes were more effective for suppressing cheatgrass, although native mixes also did reasonably well. And the native mixes were clearly the most effective for restoring native plant communities. So with that, I conclude and I open it up for questions.